They say that in New York City, money screams, but wealth whispers. But at l'Orangerie, Manhattan's most exclusive dining establishment, nobody was listening to whispers. When a man in a tattered raincoat and muddy boots walked through the golden doors, the staff saw a beggar. They saw a nuisance. They saw someone to be discarded. Only one person saw a human being. Sophie, a struggling waitress on her last warning, didn't just serve him. She shocked the entire room by speaking the one language that unlocked a secret worth billions. This is the story of how a single act of kindness and a few words of French toppled an empire and changed a life forever. The rain in Manhattan wasn't just rain, it was an assault. It lashed against the oversized bulletproof glass windows of l'Orangerie like shrapnel, blurring the lights of Fifth Avenue into a kaleidoscope of grey and neon. Inside, however, the weather didn't exist. Inside, the air was scented with white truffle and old money. Sophie adjusted her apron, her fingers trembling slightly. She was 24, with dark circles under her eyes that even the expensive concealer she'd bought at a discount couldn't fully hide. Her feet throbbed in the mandatory 2-inch heels. This was her double shift. Her rent was 3 weeks late, her student loans were a mountain she was trying to climb with a toothpick, and her manager, Preston, was currently staring at her like she was a stain on the pristine tablecloth. Preston was a man who had curated his entire personality around the concept of exclusion. He wore suits that cost more than Sophie's car, and he possessed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. A shark in Italian silk. "Table 4 needs water, Sophie," Preston snapped, snapping his fingers near her ear. "And stop slouching. You look like you're waiting for a bus, not serving the city's elite." "Yes, Preston. Sorry," Sophie murmured, grabbing the crystal pitcher. L'Orangerie was the kind of place where the menu didn't have prices. If you had to ask, you were in the wrong zip code. Tonight, the room was filled with the usual suspects: hedge fund managers celebrating a merger, a senator trying to look low profile in the center of the room, and a famous tech CEO arguing with his mistress. Then, the heavy oak doors creaked open. Usually the doorman, a burly man named Arthur, filtered the clientele before they even touched the brass handle. But Arthur was currently distracted, holding an umbrella for a socialite exiting a limousine. The man who stepped inside brought the chill of the storm with him. He was old, perhaps in his late 70s. His hair was white and plastered to his forehead by the rain. He wore a beige trench coat that had seen better decades, stained dark with water and mud at the hem. His shoes were brown leather, cracked and worn, squeaking audibly against the marble floor. He didn't carry a designer briefcase or a platinum credit card. He clutched a wet, reusable grocery bag and a weathered cane. The hum of conversation in the restaurant didn't stop, but it stuttered. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. In a room of peacocks, a stray dog had wandered in. Preston, who had been inspecting a bottle of 1982 Bordeaux, froze. His nostrils flared. He handed the wine to a junior waiter and marched toward the entrance, his heels clicking aggressively. He intercepted the old man before he could take 3 steps onto the plush carpet. "Excuse me," Preston said, his voice loud enough to carry, dripping with performative politeness that barely masked his disgust. "Deliveries are around the back." The old man looked up. His eyes were a startling shade of blue, framed by deep wrinkles. He didn't look angry, he looked weary. He blinked, water dripping from his nose. "I am not a delivery man," the stranger said. His voice was raspy, quiet. "I would like a table. For dinner." A ripple of laughter came from table 6, the hedge fund guys. Preston's back stiffened. He felt the eyes of the wealthy patrons on him. This was a test of his control over his domain. He couldn't have vagrants wandering around l'Orangerie. It ruined the aesthetic. "Sir," Preston said, dropping the volume but increasing the venom. "Look around you. This establishment requires a reservation. and a strict dress code. I'm afraid you meet neither requirement. There is a diner 3 blocks down that might accommodate your situation." The old man leaned heavily on his cane. He looked past Preston, scanning the warm, golden room. "I'm hungry," he said simply. "And I have money." "I'm sure you have a few crumpled bills," Preston scoffed, stepping closer to physically block the man's path. "But a starter here costs more than your coat. Now please leave before I call security. You are dripping on the marble." Sophie was watching from the service station, clutching a tray of silverware. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew she should look away. Involvement was professional suicide. But something about the old man tugged at her chest. He reminded her of her grandfather, a man who had worked in coal mines his whole life, who had possessed that same quiet dignity, even when the world tried to strip it away. She saw the old man's shoulders slump. It wasn't the rejection that hurt him. It was the dismissal of his humanity. He turned slowly, the rubber tip of his cane squeaking a mournful sound on the floor. "Preston," Sophie said. She hadn't meant to speak. The word just fell out of her mouth. Preston spun around, his eyes flashing dangerous fire. "Excuse me?" Sophie walked forward. The room was silent now. The patrons were watching the drama unfold. Theatre is the favorite pastime of the bored elite. "We have table 11, Sophie said, her voice shaking but her chin high. "The small two-top near the kitchen doors. It's empty. It's out of sight. He won't bother anyone." Preston stared at her like she had just spoken in tongues. "Sophie, get back to your station. Do not interfere." "It's pouring rain, Preston," she pressed, stepping between the manager and the old man. "He's an elderly man. Let him sit. Let him dry off. If he can't pay, I'll cover his bill." A gasp went through the nearby tables. Sophie Miller, who had $42 in her bank account, had just offered to cover a bill at l'Orangerie. The old man stopped turning. He looked at Sophie. For a second, the weariness vanished from his eyes, replaced by a sharp, piercing assessment. Preston's face turned a shade of puce. He was cornered. If he kicked the man out now, after his waitress had offered charity, he would look like a monster in front of the customers. But if he let him stay, he lost authority. He chose the path that saved his ego, but punished Sophie. "Fine," Preston hissed, leaning in so only Sophie could hear. "Seat him. But he is your problem. If he smells, if he begs, if he causes a single disruption, you are fired, and you are paying for whatever he eats. Full price. No staff discount." He turned on his heel and addressed the room with a clapping of hands. "Apologies for the interruption, ladies and gentlemen. Please, enjoy your evening." Sophie turned to the old man. She offered a gentle smile. "Sir, if you'll follow me, I have a warm spot for you." The old man nodded slowly. "Thank you, mademoiselle," he whispered. As Sophie led him through the restaurant, she felt the burning stares of the patrons. They looked at the old man with disdain, and at her with pity. She walked him to the back, to table 11, the worst table in the house, right next to the swinging doors of the kitchen where the noise of dishes and shouting chefs was constant. She pulled out the chair for him. He sat, placing his cane carefully against the wall. "I'm Sophie," she said softly, placing a napkin on his lap. "I'll be taking care of you tonight." She didn't know it yet, but placing that napkin was the most dangerous thing she had ever done. The kitchen door swung open, blasting a gust of hot air and the smell of roasting garlic into the corner where the old man sat. He didn't flinch. He just sat there, shivering slightly in his damp coat. Sophie rushed to the side station and grabbed a fresh, warm towel from the steamer, usually reserved for VIPs, wiping their hands after seafood. She brought it to him. "Here," she said, keeping her voice low, so Preston, who was hawking over the dining room like a vulture, wouldn't notice. "It's warm." Put this on your hands." The old man looked at the towel, then up at her. His hands were gnarled, the knuckles swollen with what looked like arthritis. He took the towel and pressed it to his face, inhaling deeply. When he lowered it, he looked less like a drowned rat and more like a tired scholar. "You are kind," he said. His accent was thick, difficult to place, but definitely European. "Most people here, they look at the coat, not the man." "It's just a coat," Sophie shrugged, pouring him a glass of water. "It doesn't tell me who you are. Do you know what you'd like? I can recommend the soup. It's potato and leek, very warming." It was also the cheapest thing on the menu, $35, and Sophie was mentally calculating how many shifts she'd need to pick up to cover it. The man reached into his coat pocket. Sophie tensed, half expecting him to pull out a flask or a weapon, as Preston had warned. Instead, he pulled out a book. It was a small, leather-bound paperback. The cover was faded, the gold lettering almost rubbed away. He placed it on the table with a reverence usually reserved for religious texts. Sophie glanced at the title, Les Misérables. But it wasn't the English translation. It was the original French text. Her eyes widened. Sophie had spent 4 years in college studying French literature on a scholarship before her mother got sick, and she had to drop out to pay medical bills. She hadn't spoken the language in 2 years, not since the funeral. It was a painful part of her past, a reminder of the life she was supposed to have before reality crushed her. She looked at the man, really looked at him. He wasn't just reading it. He was caressing the spine. Without thinking, she switched codes. The words felt rusty in her mouth, but sweet. "Victor Hugo captures the misery of the soul better than anyone," she said, in flawless, fluid French. The old man froze. His hand, reaching for the water glass, stopped in mid-air. He looked up, and the transformation was instant. The dullness in his eyes snapped into a bright electric blue intensity. "You speak French?" he replied, in the same language. His voice was no longer raspy. It was deep, resonant, and commanded the space. It was the voice of a man who was used to being heard. Sophie smiled, a genuine smile this time. "I studied it. Once upon a time, before life got in the way." The old man leaned forward. Life often gets in the way. That is the tragedy of existence. But to find a speaker of the tongue in this establishment, it is a rare flower in a concrete garden. He gestured to the menu. "I do not want the soup, Sophie. I want the coq au vin, and a bottle of the 1996 Gevrey Chambertin." Sophie's heart stopped. The coq au vin was $80. The wine was $400. "Sir," she whispered in French, glancing nervously at Preston, who was berating a busboy across the room. I have to pay for your meal. My manager, he thinks you cannot pay. The wine alone is—" The old man waved his hand dismissively. "Do not worry about the money, child. Bring the wine. I wish to talk. It has been a long time since I spoke my own language with someone who understands the nuance." There was something in his tone, an absolute, unshakable confidence that made Sophie obey. It was irrational. She was risking her rent, her job, her sanity. But she nodded. She went to the bar. The bartender, a cynical man named Greg, raised an eyebrow when she ordered the vintage bottle. "Table 11?" Greg asked. "The hobo? Preston is going to skin you alive, Sophie." "Just give it to me, Greg," she snapped. When she returned, she performed the wine service perfectly. She presented the bottle, cut the foil, uncorked it without a sound. She poured a taste. The old man swirled it, sniffed it, and sipped. He closed his eyes. "Acceptable," he murmured. "Poor." For the next hour, Table 11 became a separate world. While the rest of the restaurant engaged in loud, boastful conversations about stocks and yachts, Sophie and the old man, who introduced himself simply as Henri, spoke of literature, of philosophy, of the streets of Paris. Sophie forgot about Preston. She forgot about her aching feet. She told Henri about her mother, about dropping out of Sorbonne applications, about how she felt trapped in this city of glass and steel. Henri listened. He didn't offer platitudes. He listened with a ferocity that was almost unnerving. "You have a sharp mind, Sophie," Henri said, tearing a piece of bread. "Why are you carrying plates for men who have less intelligence in their whole bodies than you have in your little finger?" "Necessity," Sophie replied in French. "Honor doesn't pay the rent." "Honor is the only currency that matters," Henri corrected. "The rest is just paper." Suddenly, a shadow fell over the table. The spell broke. Sophie looked up to see Preston standing there. He wasn't looking at Sophie. He was looking at the bottle of 1996 Gevrey Chambertin. "What is this?" Preston asked, his voice trembling with rage. He switched to English, refusing to acknowledge the French atmosphere. "Sophie, did you serve a $400 bottle of wine to a vagrant?" "He ordered it, Preston," Sophie said, standing up. "He can't pay for it," Preston shouted. The restaurant went silent again. "And neither can you. You think you can play games in my restaurant?" Preston grabbed the bottle from the table. "I am confiscating this. The meal is over. Get out." He glared at Henri. "Now, before I call the police for theft of services." Henri slowly wiped his mouth with the napkin. He didn't look at Preston. He looked at Sophie. "Is this the man who holds your future?" Henri asked in French. "Yes," Sophie whispered. Henri stood up. He was shorter than Preston, but in that moment he seemed to tower over the manager. He picked up his cane. "I will leave," Henri said in heavily accented English. "But first, the bill." "Oh, don't bother," Preston sneered. "Sophie is paying, and then she is leaving with you, because she's fired." Sophie felt the blood drain from her face. "Preston, please!" "Fired!" Preston yelled. "Get your things! Both of you, out!" Henri reached into his inner coat pocket. Preston flinched, but Henri didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a black card. It wasn't plastic. It was heavy, anodized titanium. There were no numbers on it, just a small gold chip and a signature engraved in silver. He held it out to Preston. "Run it," Henri said. "For the wine, for the chicken, and for a $50,000 tip for the young lady." Preston stared at the card. He laughed, a cruel, barking laugh. "What is this? A library card? A joke store prop? Get out!" He slapped the card out of Henri's hand. It clattered onto the marble floor with a distinct, metallic ring that echoed through the silent restaurant. Henri looked down at the card. Then he looked at Preston. For the first time, the old man smiled. It was a terrifying smile. "You have made a mistake," Henri said softly. "A very expensive mistake." He bent down. Sophie tried to help, but he waved her away and picked up the card. He turned to Sophie. "I am sorry you lost your job, Sophie," he said in French, "but tomorrow you will understand why it was necessary." He turned and walked out of the restaurant, his cane tapping a steady rhythm. The doors closed behind him, leaving Sophie standing alone in the center of the room, unemployed, humiliated, and utterly confused. "Get out," Preston spat at her, "and take your trash with you." Sophie untied her apron, let it drop to the floor, and walked out into the rain. She thought her life was over. She had no idea it was just beginning. The morning sun over New York City didn't bring hope to Sophie. It brought a headache and a crushing sense of reality. She lay in her small basement studio apartment in Queens, staring at the water stains on the ceiling. The sounds of the city above, the screech of subway brakes, the shouting of neighbors, the heavy thrum of traffic, felt muffled, as if she were underwater. She checked her phone. No messages, No missed calls, just a notification from her bank app. Balance, 42,18. Rent was due in 3 days. She sat up, pulling the thin duvet around her shoulders. The events of the previous night played in her mind like a fever dream. Had she really served a $400 wine to a homeless man? Had she really spoken French? Had she really been fired? The uniform lying in a heap on the floor confirmed the last part. Preston had fired her for showing compassion. Stupid, Sophie whispered to the empty room. You are so stupid, Sophie. She dragged herself out of bed. She needed to update her resume. She needed to call the temp agency. She needed to figure out how to pay for groceries. But as she reached for her laptop, a loud, authoritative knock echoed on her door. Sophie froze. Her landlord, Mr. Henderson, usually texted before coming for the rent. And the police? Why would the police be here? Had Preston actually called them about the stolen wine? Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She crept to the door and looked through the peephole. It wasn't Mr. Henderson. It wasn't the police. Standing in the dim, flickering light of the hallway was a man who looked like he had stepped out of a magazine spread. He was tall, wearing a charcoal grey suit that fit him with surgical precision. He wore black leather gloves and held a tablet. Behind him, looming in the shadows, was a second man, larger, clearly security. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. She cracked the door open, leaving the chain on. Yes? She asked, her voice trembling. The man in the suit nodded politely. Miss Sophie Miller? Who's asking? My name is Luc Dubois, the man said. His accent was French, refined and clipped. I represent the private office of Monsieur Henri Valois. Sophie frowned. I don't know anyone named Valois. If this is about the wine... It is about the wine, Luc interrupted, but his tone wasn't accusatory. It was respectful. And about the dinner. Please, Miss Miller. May we come in? Or, if you prefer, there is a car waiting outside. Monsieur Valois requests your presence immediately. The old man, Sophie realized. Henri? Monsieur Valois, Luc corrected gently. He is waiting. Sophie looked at the man, then down at her sweatpants. I can't just leave. I'm not dressed. I don't understand. Take your time, Luc said. We will wait in the car, a black Mercedes SUV. Please do not take too long. Monsieur Valois does not like to be kept waiting. He handed her a card. It was thick, cream-colored cardstock with a single embossed logo, a golden lion holding a key. No phone number, just an address in Manhattan. Sophie closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. Who was this Henry? Homeless men didn't send men in bespoke suits to pick up waitresses in Queens. Homeless men didn't have private offices. Curiosity warred with fear. If she went, she might be walking into a trap. But if she stayed, she was just an unemployed waitress with $42. She looked at the uniform on the floor. She had nothing left to lose. She took the quickest shower of her life. She put on her best outfit, a simple navy blazer and black trousers she used for interviews, and brushed her hair back. She applied lipstick to hide the paleness of her lips. When she stepped out onto the sidewalk, the black Mercedes was there, idling like a beast. The back door opened before she even reached it. Meanwhile, across the river in Manhattan, the atmosphere at l'Orangerie was rapidly deteriorating. Preston arrived at the restaurant at 10 a.m. for the lunch prep, feeling a lingering sense of unease. He had slept poorly. The sound of that metal card hitting the floor kept replaying in his mind. But he brushed it off. It was a prop. It had to be. He walked into his office and poured himself a coffee. He was the king of this castle, and he had successfully purged a weak link. Sophie was too soft for this industry anyway. His office phone rang. It was the red line, the direct line from the corporate holdings group that owned l'Orangerie. Preston straightened his tie, even though no one could see him. "This is Preston," he answered smoothly. Preston, a voice barked. It was the regional director, a man named Jonathan, who usually only called to complain about profit margins. But today, Jonathan sounded terrified. "Good morning, Jonathan. To what do I owe the—" "Shut up, Preston," Jonathan hissed. "What did you do last night?" Preston blinked. I managed the floor. We had a successful service. Why?" "I just got a call from the board of directors," Jonathan said, his voice shaking. "Do you know who owns the building L'Orangerie is in? Do you know who owns the bank that finances our restaurant group?" I believe it's a holding company. Valois International?" "Exactly," Jonathan screamed. "Valois International. And do you know who Henri Valois is?" Preston felt a cold drop of sweat slide down his spine. "No. He is the chairman. He is the majority shareholder. And according to his office, he was in your restaurant last night, where he was refused service, insulted, and had his card thrown on the floor by a manager named Preston." Preston's knees gave out. He collapsed into his leather chair. The old man. The muddy coat. The French. "Jonathan, Preston stammered. "He looked like a beggar. He was wet. He had no reservation." "He owns the damn building, Preston. He can walk in naked if he wants to. He is currently conducting a quality assurance audit of his properties, and you just failed spectacularly. You better pray, Preston. You better pray he's feeling merciful. He's coming there today, at noon. Fix this, or you'll never work in this city again." The line went dead. Preston stared at the receiver. The colour drained from his face until he looked like a wax figure. He looked at the clock. 10:45 a.m. He had an hour and 15 minutes to save his life. The car ride was silent. Sophie sat in the plush leather seat, watching the city blur by. The windows were tinted so dark that the outside world looked like a movie. Luke sat in the front passenger seat, checking emails on his phone. They didn't go to a police station. They didn't go to a diner. They pulled up to the curb of the Valois Tower, a 70-story spire of glass and steel that pierced the sky in Midtown Manhattan. It was one of those buildings tourists took photos of, but were afraid to enter. "We are here," Luke said. He escorted her past the security desk, where the guards nodded at him with deference, and to a private elevator. There were no buttons inside. Luke swiped a keycard, and the car shot upward. Sophie's ears popped. "Where are we going?" "The penthouse," Luke replied. "Mr. Valois' residence." The doors slid open, revealing a space that was larger than Sophie's entire apartment building. The floor was white marble, veined with gold. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a 360-degree view of New York City. The furniture was modern, minimalist, and terrifyingly expensive. But what caught Sophie's eye wasn't the luxury. It was the books. One entire wall, perhaps 20 feet high, was a library. Thousands of books, old and new, lined the shelves. A rolling ladder was attached to the rail. Standing by the window, looking out at the Empire State Building, was a man. He turned. It was Henry. Gone was the dirty trench coat. Gone was the matted hair. He was wearing a navy blue three-piece suit that fit his slender frame perfectly. A silk cravat was tied loosely at his neck. His white hair was groomed back, revealing a face that was sharp, intelligent, and powerful. Only the eyes were the same, that piercing electric blue. "Sophie," he said. His voice was warm, lacking the raspy quality of the night before. "Welcome to my home." He spoke in French. Sophie stepped out of the elevator, clutching her purse. "Henri? You are—" "Henri Valois," he finished, walking toward her. He didn't use a cane today. He moved with the grace of a man who owned the ground he walked on. "I apologize for the deception last night. It is a necessary habit of mine." "You're a billionaire," Sophie said in English, the shock making her switch languages. "I am a businessman," Henri corrected with a small smile. The billions are just a byproduct of doing things correctly. He gestured to a seating area. Please, sit. Luke, tea. Sophie sat on the edge of a velvet sofa. Why? Why dress like that? Why come to l'Orangerie? Henri sat opposite her, crossing his legs. I own l'Orangerie, Sophie. I own the group that manages it. I own the hotel next door. I own this tower. But when you sit in a glass tower, people tell you what you want to hear. They show you spreadsheets that say everything is perfect. They polish the floors only when they know you are coming. He leaned forward. To know the truth, you must become invisible. I dress as a man of no consequence to see how my staff treats the least among us, because how you treat a king is irrelevant. It is how you treat a beggar that reveals your character. Sophie nodded slowly. It made sense. It was terrifying, but it made sense. And Preston failed, she whispered. Preston failed catastrophically, Henri agreed. But you passed, and not just because you were kind. Kindness is common enough, though rare in New York. You passed because you were observant. You saw the book. You engaged with the mind, not the appearance. You spoke the language of culture when everyone else spoke the language of money. Luke appeared silently, placing a silver tea service on the table before vanishing again. I have a proposition for you, Sophie, Henri said. I don't want charity, Sophie said quickly, her pride flaring up. If this is about giving me money because I was nice, I can't take it. I can find another waitressing job. Henri laughed. It was a rich, hearty sound. Charity? My dear girl, I didn't get to this chair by giving away money. I am a capitalist. I invest in assets, and I believe I have found an undervalued asset. He picked up a folder from the table and slid it toward her. Open it. Sophie opened the folder. It was a contract, but not for a waitress position. Position: junior associate, cultural liaison, and guest experience audit. Salary: $120,000 per annum. Sophie gasped. She dropped the folder. I don't understand. I don't have a degree. I dropped out. I know, Henri said. I had Luke run a background check this morning. You dropped out to care for your mother, Marie Miller, who passed away 2 years ago from cancer. You have worked double shifts for 3 years to pay off her medical debts. You have never been late. You have never had a complaint. Sophie felt tears prick her eyes. It felt invasive, yet validating. Someone had finally seen her struggle. A degree proves you can take tests, Henri said. Last night proved you can handle pressure, you can read people, and you have integrity. I can teach you business, Sophie. I cannot teach you how to be a human being. That you already know. He stood up and walked to the window. But there is a catch. Sophie wiped her eyes. What is it? I'm going back to l'Orangerie for lunch today, to finish my meal, and to deal with Preston. He turned to look at her, his eyes hard as diamonds. I want you to come with me, not as a waitress, but as my guest, and as the person who will decide his fate. Sophie's stomach flipped. You want me to fire him? I want you to witness justice, Henri said, and I want you to see if you have the stomach for the world you are about to enter. It is not always kind, Sophie. Sometimes it must be ruthless. He held out his hand. Will you join me? Sophie looked at his hand. She thought of Preston's sneer. She thought of the way he snapped his fingers at her. She thought of the trash comment. She stood up. She took Henri's hand. Yes, she said. I'm ready. At 12:15 p.m., l'Orangerie was in full swing. It was the power lunch hour. The sunlight streamed through the clean windows, illuminating the expensive suits and designer dresses of the clientele. Preston was pacing near the host stand, sweating through his shirt. He had spent the last hour terrorizing the staff, making sure every fork was polished, every napkin folded to a micrometer of precision. He had rehearsed his apology 1,000 times. He would blame the lighting. He would blame the stress. He would beg. The double doors opened. Arthur, the doorman, held them wide, bowing lower than he ever had in his life. Henri Valois walked in. The transformation in the room was palpable. It wasn't just that he was dressed in a suit that cost more than a luxury car. It was the aura he projected. He walked with a cane, not out of weakness, but as a scepter. He owned the air in the room, and on his arm was Sophie. She wore a dress Luke had procured for her from the Tower's boutique, a stunning, simple black sheath dress that made her look elegant and formidable. Her hair was up. Her chin was high. The restaurant fell silent. The regulars recognized Henri immediately, not as the beggar from last night, but as the titan of industry they saw on the cover of Forbes. Whispers hissed across the room. "Is that Valois? Who is the girl? Wait, isn't that the waitress?" Preston froze. He looked at Henri, then at Sophie. His brain couldn't compute the image. The girl he had fired 12 hours ago was now walking arm in arm with the owner of the company. Henri didn't stop at the host stand. He walked straight into the center of the room. He stopped at table 6, the prime table, currently occupied by the senator and his wife. "Excuse me," Henri said smoothly. "I believe this is my table." The senator looked up, annoyed, then saw who it was. He scrambled to his feet, knocking over his water. "Monsieur Valois, I didn't know you were in town. Of course, we were just leaving." The senator abandoned his lobster and practically ran away. The power dynamic was clear. In the food chain of New York, Henri Valois was the apex predator. Henri sat. He gestured for Sophie to sit opposite him. Preston approached. His legs felt like jelly. He was trembling so hard the menus in his hands shook. Monsieur Valois," Preston stammered. "Welcome back to l'Orangerie. It is the greatest honor." Henri didn't look at him. He picked up the linen napkin and unfolded it, placing it on his lap with deliberate slowness. "The menu," Henri said to the heir. Preston scrambled to hand them the menus. I have taken the liberty of preparing the chef's special tasting menu for you, sir. And a bottle of our finest. I want the coq au vin," Henri interrupted, still not looking at him. "And the 1996 Gevrey Chambertin. The bottle you confiscated last night." The silence in the restaurant was deafening. Every patron was watching. They sensed the executioner's blade hanging in the air. Preston turned pale. "Sir, regarding last night, I must explain. It was a misunderstanding. I was protecting the integrity of your establishment. I had no idea it was you. If I had known..." Henri finally looked up. His blue eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth he had shown Sophie in the penthouse. "That is exactly the problem, Preston," Henri said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "If you had known it was me, you would have kissed my feet. But because you thought I was poor, you treated me like vermin." He gestured to Sophie. "And this woman, do you recognize her?" Preston swallowed hard. He couldn't bring himself to look at Sophie. "Yes, Sophie. She is a former employee." "She is my guest," Henri corrected. "And she is the only person in this building who understands the meaning of hospitality. You fired her for showing human decency." Henri reached into his pocket. He pulled out the black titanium card. He placed it on the table. It made the same metallic clink as the night before. "You said this was a fake," Henri said. "Run it." "Sir, please, there is no need." "Run it!" Henri's voice cracked like a whip. Preston took the card with trembling fingers. He walked to the terminal station near the center of the room. He swiped the card. The machine beeped. A receipt printed. Preston stared at the receipt. It wasn't a standard approval. The POS system, recognizing the owner's override card, had printed a system report. Authorization: Valois Global Holdings, Level 1 clearance, action, asset liquidation. Preston looked up, confused. Asset liquidation? Henri stood up. He turned to the dining room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Henri announced. "I apologize for the disturbance, but l'Orangerie is under new management as of this moment." He turned to Preston. "You are relieved of your duties, Preston. Effective immediately. You will clear out your office. You have 10 minutes before security escorts you from the premises." Preston gasped. You can't just fire me. I have a contract. I doubled the profits this quarter." "You damaged the brand," Henri said calmly. "And you insulted my associate." He pointed to Sophie. Preston looked at Sophie with pure hatred. "Her? She's a nobody. She's a waitress who can't even afford rent." Sophie stood up. Her heart was pounding, but she remembered what Henri had said about ruthlessness. She looked Preston in the eye. "I may have been a waitress," Sophie said, her voice steady. "But I never treated anyone the way you treated him. Goodbye, Preston." "Get out!" Preston screamed, lunging forward. Two large men, security guards who had been waiting by the kitchen doors, stepped forward instantly, grabbing Preston by the arms. They dragged him, kicking and shouting, toward the exit. "You'll regret this," Preston yelled as he was hauled out onto Fifth Avenue. "I am l'Orangerie." The doors slammed shut. The silence returned. Henri sat back down. He looked at Sophie and winked. "Now," he said in French, "shall we have some wine?" Sophie sat down, her legs shaking. She looked around the room. The other waiters, her former colleagues, were staring at her with awe and fear. The patrons were whispering excitedly. She realized with a sudden jolt that her life as she knew it was dead. The waitress was gone. Something else was taking her place. But as the waiter poured the wine, her hand trembling slightly as she accepted the glass, she noticed something. The waiter was the young busboy, Tim, who Preston always bullied. Tim looked at Sophie and gave her a tiny, hidden smile, a thumbs up. Sophie smiled back. "To new beginnings," Henri said, raising his glass. "To being seen," Sophie replied, clinking her glass against his. But just as the wine touched her lips, the double doors of the restaurant burst open again. It wasn't Preston. It was a woman. She was tall, dressed in white, with hair like spun gold, and a face that was beautiful but hard as ice. She marched into the restaurant, flanked by two lawyers carrying briefcases. Henri's smile vanished. He lowered his glass. "Oh no," he whispered. "Who is that?" Sophie asked, sensing the sudden tension radiating from Henri. "My daughter," Henri murmured. "Genevieve. And she is not here to eat." Genevieve marched straight to the table. She didn't look at Henri. She looked directly at Sophie, her eyes scanning her up and down with clinical detachment. "So," Genevieve said, her voice dripping with disdain, "this is the stray you picked up? The one you're rewriting the corporate bylaws for?" She slammed a legal document onto the table, overturning the wine glass. The dark red liquid spilled across the white tablecloth like blood. "We need to talk, Father," Genevieve hissed, "before you give away my inheritance to the help." The wine spreading across the tablecloth looked like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. The restaurant had gone deathly quiet again. But this was a different kind of silence. The silence with Preston had been anticipation. This silence was terror. Genevieve Valois didn't look like her father. Where Henri had warmth buried beneath his wrinkles, Genevieve was all hard angles and polished surfaces. She was 45, dressed in a white power suit that cost more than the restaurant's monthly revenue, and she looked at Sophie as if she were a bacteria on a microscope slide. "Clean that up," Genevieve snapped at a passing busboy without looking at him. She kept her eyes locked on Henri. "Genevieve," Henri sighed, leaning back in his chair. He looked suddenly older, the spark in his blue eyes dimming slightly. "I am having lunch. Do not make a scene." "You made the scene, Father," Genevieve hissed, slamming her hand on the table. "You were wandering Fifth Avenue last night, looking like a vagrant. The board is in a panic. The stock dropped 2 points this morning because rumors are circulating that the chairman has finally lost his mind." She pointed a manicured finger at Sophie. "And now I find you here, playing fairy godmother to a waitress? I saw the unauthorized transfer, Father. The salary offer. The position. Cultural liaison. It's absurd." "It is necessary," Henri said calmly. "The soul of the company is rotting, Genevieve. You look at the numbers, but you do not see the people." "The numbers are the people," she countered. She turned to the 2 lawyers standing behind her like stone gargoyles. "Give him the papers." One of the lawyers stepped forward and placed a thick document on the wet tablecloth. "What is this?" Henri asked. "It is a petition for an emergency competency hearing," Genevieve said, her voice dropping to a cruel whisper. "We are invoking Article 25 of the company charter. If you are found mentally unfit and dressing as a hobo to test soup kitchens definitely qualifies, I take immediate control of the voting shares, and you go to that nice facility in Switzerland we talked about." Sophie watched the exchange, her stomach churning. She saw Henri's hand tremble as he reached for the papers. She realized suddenly that the billionaire wasn't invincible. He was an old man, surrounded by vultures who waited for him to stumble. Genevieve turned her cold gaze to Sophie. "And you, Miss Miller, if you sign that employment contract, I will sue you for elder abuse and manipulation. I will tie you up in court until you are 80 years old. Walk away. Now." Sophie looked at the door. It was open. She could run. She could go back to her basement apartment, find a diner job, and forget this crazy whirlwind. It was the safe choice. But then she looked at Henri. He wasn't looking at the papers. He was looking at her. There was no plea in his eyes, only a quiet resignation. He expected her to leave. Everyone else always did when the money was threatened. Sophie stood up. Genevieve smirked. "Smart girl. Go." Sophie didn't move toward the door. She moved between Henri and Genevieve. She picked up the soggy legal documents, folded them closed, and placed them aside. "He isn't going to sign those," Sophie said. Her voice shook, but she forced it to be loud enough to be heard. Genevieve laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Excuse me? Do you know who I am?" "I know what you are," Sophie said. She felt a surge of adrenaline, the same protective instinct she had felt for her sick mother when doctors tried to rush them out of the hospital. "You're a bully, and you're wrong. I am his daughter." "Then act like it," Sophie snapped. The restaurant gasped. "He didn't dress up as a homeless man because he's crazy. He did it because he cares about the things you've forgotten. He did it to see if there was any humanity left in the empire he built, and he found out there wasn't. Not until he met me." Sophie switched to French. It was a calculated risk. "Does your father speak French to you, Genevieve?" Genevieve blinked, taken aback. "Of course. We are French." "Then why do you not listen to him?" Sophie continued in rapid, fluid French. "He is not looking for a nurse. He is looking for an heir. Not an heir to the money, but to the legacy. You want the bank accounts, but you don't want the weight of the name." Genevieve's face flushed red. "Speak English. This is America. See?" Sophie switched back to English. "You don't even want to speak his language. You don't understand him at all." She turned to Henri. "Henri, you offered me a job. Junior associate. I accept. And my first act as your associate is to advise you to refuse these papers." Henri looked at Sophie. A slow smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile since Genevieve had entered. He sat up straighter. The frailty vanished. "You are right, Sophie," Henri said. He looked at his daughter. "Genevieve, you have made a tactical error." "The court will decide that," Genevieve threatened. "No," Henri said. "They won't. Because you forgot to read the addendum to Article 25, the moral turpitude clause. Henry tapped the table. Luke? Luke, the assistant who had been standing silently in the shadows near the kitchen, stepped forward. He held a small tablet. We have it all on video, sir, Luke said. Video of what? Genevieve demanded. Of the last 24 hours, Henri said. My glasses. They contain a micro camera. I record all my audits. Henry stood up, leaning on the table. I have hours of footage of you, Genevieve, screaming at staff, conspiring with these lawyers to falsify my medical records, and just now, threatening a young woman with frivolous litigation. If you file those papers, I will release the footage to the board and to the press. Genevieve went pale. You wouldn't. It would destroy the stock price. I built the stock price, Henri roared, his voice thundering through the restaurant, and I can burn it down if I have to. Do not test me, child. I am not sundowning. I am just waking up. He pointed to the door. Take your lawyers. Go to the office. Pack your things. You are on sabbatical. Indefinitely. Genevieve stared at him. She looked at the tablet in Luke's hand. She realized she had been outplayed. The crazy old man had been 3 steps ahead the entire time. She looked at Sophie with pure venom. You think you've won the lottery, she hissed, but you have no idea what you've walked into. He will use you and discard you. Maybe, Sophie said, but he'll pay for dinner first. Genevieve stormed out, her heels clicking angrily on the marble, her lawyers trailing behind her like beaten dogs. The restaurant erupted into applause. It started with Tim the busboy, then the bartender, and soon even the wealthy patrons were clapping. Henri sat back down, exhaling a long, shaky breath. He looked tired but triumphant. That, Henri said to Sophie, was the most difficult thing I have done in 20 years. She's your daughter, Sophie said softly, sitting down. It can't be easy. No, Henri said. He reached across the table and patted Sophie's hand. But you were magnificent. You fought for me. Why? Sophie thought about it. Because yesterday, when you were wet and cold, you reminded me of my grandfather. But today, you just looked like a man who needed a friend. Henri smiled. And I have found one. 3 years later. The rain in Paris was softer than the rain in New York. It misted over the Seine, turning the streetlights into glowing orbs of amber. Sophie Miller stepped out of the black sedan in front of the Palais Garnier, the grand opera house. She wasn't wearing a waitress uniform. She was wearing a tailored emerald gown that shimmered under her trench coat. She moved with confidence, holding a stack of programs in her hand. She was no longer just Sophie the waitress. She was the executive director of the Valois Philanthropic Trust. She walked up the steps, where the gala was in full swing. The elite of Europe were there. But tonight, the gala wasn't for profit. It was for the Literacy and Arts Initiative, a program that funded libraries and language classes for underprivileged communities across the globe. Mademoiselle Miller, a reporter shouted from the press line. A quote about tonight's success? Sophie paused and smiled at the camera. Tonight proves that talent is universal, but opportunity is not. We are here to balance the scales. She walked inside, greeting donors in fluent French, then switching to English for the American ambassador, and then German for a visiting dignitary. She had spent the last 3 years studying as hard as she worked. She made her way to the private box on the mezzanine level. She pulled back the heavy velvet curtain. Henri was there. He sat in a wheelchair now, a blanket over his knees. His hair was thinner and his skin was like parchment. But his eyes, those electric blue eyes, were still sharp. You are late, Henri rasped, though his eyes were smiling. I was making money for your legacy, old man, Sophie teased, kissing him on the cheek. We raised €4 million in the first hour. Peanuts, Henry scoffed, but he squeezed her hand. Sit, the aria is about to start. Sophie sat beside him. They looked down at the stage. I have something for you, Henri said. He reached into his pocket. It wasn't the black credit card this time. It was an old, heavy iron key. What is this? Sophie asked. It is the key to the bookstore on the left bank, Henri said. The one where I bought that copy of Les Miserables 50 years ago. I bought the building last week. Henri, I don't need a bookstore. It is not for business, Henri said softly. It is for you. I transferred the deed to your name this morning, not as an employee, but as my... He hesitated. As family. Sophie felt tears prick her eyes. Henri? Genevieve never understood, Henri whispered, looking at the stage. She thought wealth was what you kept in the bank. You taught me that wealth is what you give away. You saved me, Sophie. That night in the rain, you didn't just serve me dinner. You saved my soul. He turned to her. I am tired, Sophie. The doctors say I do not have many galas left. Don't talk like that, Sophie said, clutching the key. It is the truth. But I am not afraid, Henri said, because I know the flame will not go out. You carry it now. The music began. The soprano's voice soared to the high ceiling of the opera house. It was a song of tragedy and redemption. Sophie looked at the key in her hand, then at the old man who had changed her life. She thought back to that night at l'Orangerie. The fear, the rain, the decision to break the rules for a stranger. She realized then that Henri was right. The universe had tested her. It had sent a king disguised as a beggar to see if she was worthy. And she hadn't just passed the test. She had rewritten it. She took Henri's hand in hers. Merci, Henri, she whispered. No, Henri replied, closing his eyes as the music washed over them. Merci, Sophie. Below them, the world applauded. But in the quiet of the box, a waitress and a billionaire sat in silence, bound not by money, but by the language of the heart. And that is the story of Sophie and Henri. It reminds us that character is revealed not when we are being watched by the powerful, but when we are faced with the powerless. Sophie thought she was risking her job for a $35 soup, but she was actually auditioning for the role of a lifetime. In a world obsessed with status, she proved that kindness is the ultimate currency. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story that touches the heart. Share this video with someone who believes that good things happen to good people. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.